Hello there, I'm Stephen Farris and welcome to my channel At Home with the Bible. This is part 2 of a story that I wrote called The Inn. The story can be found if you're interested in my book, So Tell Me a Story, The Art of Storytelling for Preaching and Teaching, and I'll put a link in the description for an Amazon purchase of this book if you're so interested. Well, let's pick up where we left off. The years passed. Simon, no longer the cabin boy, had never grown beyond the middle height, but the years of hauling on ship's lines and wrestling with the great sweep oar rudder had broadened his shoulders and filled out his chest. Few drinkers in the waterfront inns frequented by sailors would dare to challenge his massive strength. Not that Simon sought trouble. He had, he often said, seen enough trouble and cruelty to last a lifetime. With his sturdy frame and corded muscles, he could have made a name for himself in the fights that broke out in the sailors' quarters of the port cities, but he avoided trouble rather than seeking it out. In the fullness of time, Reuben chose to rest from his seafaring, and Simon, with the coins saved from his uncle, bought the ship. As captain, he was famed not only for his great strength, but for his gentleness. The only thing that ever roused him to anger was any sort of cruelty. He took his ship into the lucrative trade in grain between North Africa and Rome, and he prospered. But Simon was alone. There are men, and many of them are sailors, who have been created by the Mighty One for aloneness. They wanted the earth and the seas also, never mooring long in any haven, and never linking their lives to any person. Simon was alone, but he was never made for aloneness. Wherever he sailed, he sought out his own people, worshipping in the synagogues, though the righteous scorned him, for as he was a sailor, he could not fully keep the Sabbath laws. He found a warmer welcome in the few inns kept by his compatriots. There was an inn he favored in the green port of Cyrene. There he took his ease between voyages, sipping slowly at his wine mixed with water. The innkeeper had 2 daughters, and the younger, thought Simon, was as great an attraction to lonely sailors as the wine. The younger daughter was named Rachel, and she was as lovely, all considered, as her remote ancestor. Her older sister was named Leah. It was said that her father had given her that name when she came twisted from her mother's womb. A cruel naming it was, thought Simon, but a truthful one. For all loved Rachel, but Leah was disregarded. One dark evening, as Rachel laughed and flirted by the bar with the handsome young merchants from the city, Leah served the more humble customers in the common room, sailors and travelers of every sort. Simon was seated there, and near him 2 sailors from the western coasts. They were well into their cups, he could tell. Still, after the custom of their kind, they called to Leah for more. When she leaned over the table, the one seated nearest to Simon grasped her roughly by her twisted thigh, just where it joined a surprisingly well-rounded hip. "Give us a squeeze, sweetie," he leered. Her sister Rachel was well used to such advances, and always twisted lightly through drunken attempts to grapple. Leah, it was clear, was neither so agile nor so accustomed to such approaches. "Please, sir, let me go," she cried. The other sailor groped forward also. "Listen, sweetie, girl that looks like you can't be choosy. You ought to be glad that real men like us even want to touch you." He reached forward to stroke her long, dark hair. Leah turned from his reaching hand, her face now fully visible to Simon. There were tears welling up under the dark lashes. The words, it appeared, were more cruel than the groping hands. For the briefest of moments, Leah's eyes met Simon's. Then she turned still farther from him in her shame. With grace, born of 1,000 storm-tossed nights on the great sea, Simon slipped forward. He grasped the offending arms by the wrists and slowly, irresistibly, bent the arms backward. The owner of the arms struggled briefly, then flopped backward on the bench, unable to move. "You are troubling this lady. I take it you want to apologize and return to your ship to sleep it off. Nod if that's what you mean." A slightly increased pressure on the captive arms produced the nod. Simon released the arms, and the sailors almost tumbled over one another in their haste to get out of the inn. Leah turned to Simon. "Thank you, sir," she said. "You can't know what we folk who work in inns have to endure at times." She blinked the tears out of her eyes and smiled gently at Simon. Very fine eyes they were, thought Simon, now that he saw them more clearly. Strange that he had never noticed those eyes before. "In truth, I do know what inn folk suffer. I grew up in an inn, back in Judea," he said. "Indeed, sir. I had thought you were always a sailor. The word goes round that you were a good captain to sail with. Perhaps you would tell me one day how a boy from a Judean inn became a seafarer. When you have the chance, that is. But I mustn't keep you and the others are calling for their wine." All that evening, Simon watched not Rachel, but Leah. As he watched, he marveled at the quickness and grace with which, despite her twisted hip and damaged leg, she moved among the tables, laden though she always was with food and drink. Like a seaworthy vessel for those with eyes to see, he thought. A verse from the writings came to his mind. "3 things are too wonderful for me. 4 I do not understand. The way of an eagle in the sky, the way of a serpent on a rock, the way of a ship on the high seas, and the way of a man with a maiden." Now, why did I think of that just now? Simon wondered. As the inn grew quiet, he beckoned her to sit down next to him, and for the first time in many years began to tell his story. In truth, for a lonely man, there is little that is more winning than a woman who listens not just with her ears, but with her eyes also, for the eyes are the windows of the soul. The story was too long for one evening's telling, so Simon returned for another. On the 3rd, they spoke of other things. And on the 4th, Simon spoke to Leah's father. "You want Leah?" said her father. "You mean Rachel, don't you? I always thought I'd have to pay a man to take Leah off my hands, but you actually want her?" Leah listened with head bowed and eyes clouded again with tears. "Sir, I would not take the smallest coin from you. Indeed, I would gladly give all I have for a wife such as Leah, worthy of a patriarch in Israel, let alone a poor sailor. Poor? But I thought—" "He has more than enough, Father, and more than I could ever ask," replied Leah, looking only to Simon. And so it was agreed. Simon took Leah away from the inn, though often she returned to help her father in the busy times. In the course of time, Leah conceived, and while Simon was afloat somewhere south of Sicily, bore him a fine son. It was a mighty struggle for her, for the child, it was plain to see, would have his father's frame. When the midwife held the newborn child to her cheek, the boy clenched his tiny fist and shook it at the world. "See the little conqueror," said the midwife. So Leah named the child Alexander, for Simon was not present to exercise a father's right of naming. Leah's father was pleased with Leah, the more that Rachel, now married also, had borne only a daughter. "A fine son you bear to me. Perhaps you're worth something after all," shouted the old innkeeper in his glee. When the words were told to Simon on his return, he was displeased. Nevertheless, he loved the child, and for his sake, and for Leah's also, spoke no word of reproach to his father-in-law. When Alexander was a small boy, running about the home with wooden sword and threatening wars of conquest against the neighboring cats and the dogs, Leah conceived again. By now, Simon owned several ships and did not always voyage with his vessels. He was present for the birth, if it can be said that a man is present for such things, for the midwife and the other old women drove him from his own house. "We will call you when it's necessary," they said. The women did not call him until night had drawn on, though the pains had grasped Leah at the dawn of the day. "You have a second fine son," said the midwife, touching Simon's forearm gently. "But it has been too much for Leah. She cannot live long." Simon bent over the low bed where Leah lay. She was white as the clouds over the great sea on a fine summer's day, and her breath was as quiet as the land breeze on a still morning. He could not speak, for the tears were flowing backward into his throat. Leah opened her fine eyes and whispered to her husband, "Do not let my father have the boys while you are at sea. Care for them yourself. And I thank you. Thank you for it all." And her eyes closed, and she was at rest. Simon named their son Reuben, for he remembered his old master, and also the words of the ancestor Leah in the Torah. "Perhaps the Lord will look on my affliction and be merciful," he said. But Reuben was red of hair and skin, so the neighbors all called him not Reuben, but Rufus. The last words of his wife troubled Simon greatly, for he too did not want to leave his sons to be reared by their grandfather. But how was a sailor to watch over small children? In the end, he spoke to his father-in-law. "When a man grows older, he begins to think again of the land of his youth. I've said, next year in Jerusalem too often. I will take my sons and return to Judea. I'll sell my ships and take up your trade, the trade of my youth also. I will keep an inn and care for my sons as they grow." The old man grew pale when he heard the news. "It will be a hard thing for me to miss my grandsons," he said. "But they are your sons and Leah's also. You must do what seems right in your eyes." He rummaged behind a wine cask and withdrew a surprisingly heavy sack. "But take this gift for the boys, for you refused any bride money from me, and with it take my blessing for my grandsons and for you also." So when it was safe for the newborn to travel, they parted, more at peace than Simon had dared expect. He did not fear trouble when he reached Jerusalem, for King Herod was long dead, and the Romans now ruled directly rather than merely through a local representative. He consulted those who knew the country round about, asking where he could purchase an inn. "Any little place, not too far from Jerusalem," he said, "but not Bethlehem." When pressed for a reason, he simply replied, "Too many memories." A sufficient supply of money ensures that such demands are easily met, and within the month, Simon and his sons were settled in a village less than a day's walk from Jerusalem. The land was more peaceful under Rome than under Herod, though the taxes were onerous, and the zealots always threatened an outbreak. But the troublemakers, respectful of Simon's sea-hardened limbs, stayed away from Simon's establishment, and it became a favorite stopping place for the quieter sort of traveler. The boys grew straight and healthy with the promise of their father's strength, and from their earliest years, their mother's gentle eyes. The inn was a bustling place at Passover time, when so many of the people of God wished to remember their ancient salvation from Egypt within the bounds of the holy city of Jerusalem. One year, so great was the crush in Simon's hostelry that he feared that he would run out of wine for his guests. It was the 6th day, and little time was left before the beginning of the Sabbath. Simon decided that nothing else could be done except to go to Jerusalem to arrange for a fresh supply of wine. His business done, and the shipment arranged to the satisfaction of Simon and his supplier, Simon strolled in the direction of the Temple Mount. As he made his way through the festival crowds, he heard a hubbub ahead. Make way, shouted a guard in Latin-accented Aramaic. Never stand in the way of Roman law, or it'll be the worse for you. Simon was pressed by the crush of the crowd against the clay brick wall of a harness and leather shop. Though he had no wish to see yet more cruelty, the density of the crowd made escape impossible. He witnessed, unwillingly, a squad of leather-clad Roman soldiers, executioners rather, driving 3 condemned criminals before them. As was the custom, the 3 were each carrying a patibulum, the rough and heavy cross timber that would be hoisted into place on the upright. The 3rd poor chap was struggling dreadfully under the weight. For some reason, a circlet of thorns had been thrust down on his head, and he was wearing the remains of a robe that looked for all the world as if it were royal purple. It was apparent that he'd been savagely beaten. The wounds of the many tails of a Roman scourge marked his back. As Simon watched, the criminal fell, only to be booted to his feet with the thud of heavy army sandals. But he could not stand long under the weight. In the road opposite Simon, he staggered again and fell face down on the cobblestones. Again the boot went in, but it was apparent even to the guards that this time the condemned would not be able to rise again. The sergeant of the guard looked about and caught the eye of Simon. For the briefest of seconds he appraised the breadth of Simon's shoulders. "You there," he shouted, "pick up this cross." A murmur arose amongst the crowd. "He's a respectable sort, to be made to carry a criminal's cross. Shame," the voices said. The sergeant hesitated. It was true that he'd been ordered not to cause unnecessary offense, especially during the feast days when feelings always ran high against Rome. The centurion would not thank him if he caused a riot. It was whispered in the barracks that even Pilate himself was eager not to offend the bloody Jews, not since that last protest almost got him removed from office. It was very likely that the sergeant would not have pressed the issue. But by then Simon had bent down and caught sight of the eyes of the condemned man. There was something about those eyes, Simon thought. Then, to his utter amazement, the criminal smiled into Simon's eyes. Without a further thought, Simon bent down and heaved the patibulum to his shoulders. Though still a strong man, Simon was no longer young, and the sea muscles had been softened by the easy life of the inn. Simon staggered, and his breath was drawn out of him in rending gasps. The last uphill climb to the place called the Skull blurred his mind and all but blinded his vision. "Down here, fellow," came the clipped voice of an officer, and the cross-piece slipped from Simon's weary grasp. Simon stooped, hands on knees, waiting for his breathing to slow and his vision to clear. When he looked up, he saw before his eyes a neighbor from his village. "What in heaven's name are you doing with that cross?" Simon asked the friend. "They made me," croaked Simon when he could speak. Why are you here?" "That one robbed and beat my old mother," he replied, indicating the criminal on the left. "I'm here to see that he pays for his sins." Meanwhile, the guards, practiced and efficient, had hoisted the first 2 criminals into their places and had laid the 3rd, the one whom Simon had helped, on the patibulum. Simon looked away, but he could not avoid the sound of the hammers. In a twinkling they had run a line over the top of the upright, which had remained fixed in place, and were hoisting the heavy laden patibulum into place. No sound came from the criminal except a long, shuddering intake of breath. The officer in charge handed a crudely lettered placard to a guard who nailed it to the cross. "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews," it read. Political affair, this. remarked the villager. Ever heard of him? Heard of him, like everybody else, but never paid much attention, replied Simon. The only Jesus I ever knew personally was taken to Egypt years ago when I was a kid. But the two villagers were not the only ones to notice the sign. An old man, clad gorgeously in the livery of the temple, but with a terrible squint in one eye, bustled angrily to the officer. That sign's not right. You need to change the wording. The officer shrugged. Orders. We'll see about that. My master will speak to Pilate about it. You can be sure of that. The officer merely shrugged again, muttered, Whatever you like, and turned away. The richly dressed old man paused, speechless, then hurried down the hill in the direction of the temple. Only a few women, one, the eldest, supported by a young man with strange, dreamy eyes, were left by the foot of the cross. Simon remembered his duties. Must be going, he said. I don't like this sort of thing. Never have. Not for any of them. With a last glance at the face of the political one, he turned for home. No smile now, he thought soberly. The next day, Simon's companion at the place of the skull came into the inn after the synagogue service. Did you stay to the end? Simon asked. It is, after all, an innkeeper's duty as a host to foster conversation on the affairs of the day. Yes, it didn't last as long as usual this time. They broke the legs of my fellow and the other thief to put them away before the Sabbath began. That Jesus chap was dead already. I suppose he couldn't last very long after the beating they gave him, but they stuck a spear in him to make sure. Poor fellow, Simon replied gently. But life was too busy in the aftermath of the festival to worry about Roman justice or anything else, except ensuring that the wine kept flowing for the pilgrims making their way home after the Passover. It was evening the next day, the first day of the week, before Simon could pause to draw a breath. He leaned against the doorpost of his inn and admired the sunset. Nothing like the sunsets over the great sea, though, he thought. 3 men were walking towards the inn. Simon recognized one as an occasional patron, though he could not at the moment recall his name. The man in the center, hooded and indistinct in the gathering dusk, appeared intent on walking farther before nightfall, but Simon's customer had grasped him by the elbow and was pointing to the inn. With some reluctance, the hooded man gave way, and the 3 made their way toward the inn. Simon retreated to his usual post behind the bar, and beyond a slight nod of recognition did not trouble the 3 who, it appeared, were continuing a lively conversation. The 3 took their places, as so many had before at the innkeeper's table. At length the customer, what was his name, signaled to Simon for bread and wine, and Simon readily obliged. The hooded stranger pushed back his head covering, broke the bread, held it out to his neighbors, and pronounced the ancient prayer. Blessed art thou, Lord our God, King of the universe, who givest us bread from the ground. The other 2 guests fell back on their benches as if paralyzed with astonishment. The one who prayed glanced at them, fallen back with mouths agape, rose and walked quietly toward the door. As he passed Simon's station, he paused, turned to Simon and said, "Yet one more time will you see me?" Simon looked up from his casks. He saw a face marked with a ring of scars about the brows. He looked into the stranger's eyes and realized that the eyes knew him well, and that he knew the eyes also. From Friday, from his youth. "It's you," he whispered in astonishment. The figure did not linger, but turned and slipped through the open door into the springtime darkness. Suddenly the remaining two at their table awoke as from a marvelous dream. It was he! Here in Emmaus, they said to one another. Did you see him? Did you see him too? Do you know who he is? They asked Simon. I did. And I do, he whispered in return. But they did not wait to hear the reply. They tossed a pair of coins to Simon and burst out the door in the direction of Jerusalem. Yet one more time, thought Simon. I will wait. I will wait, Master. And Simon did wait. With every new guest who drew near the inn, he wondered, is this the one? Sometimes when a pious guest broke bread and intoned the ancient prayers, his breath caught in his throat and his stomach quivered, but it was never the one. While Simon waited, the boys grew strong and tall. They became followers of the way, and like their father, great travelers. They were not sailors, however, but preachers of the word of Messiah Jesus. And still Simon waited. As he waited, the once strong limbs grew ever more feeble, and the voice that had shouted commands against gales on the great sea dwindled to a hoarse whisper. All that remained strong in Simon was an inalterable conviction. He promised, he would say to himself, yet once more. In the end, Simon could not even lift his own head from the pillow of his straw bed, but had to be cradled in the arms of a maidservant to sip his nourishment. By then, the kindly neighbors had sent word to Alexander and to Rufus. They returned before the end and held their father's withered hands. The brothers watched and listened as the now sunken chest lifted for its last time, and they mourned. But there was one strange thing they recalled as they sat through the traditional days of mourning for their father. Just at the end, at the very moment Simon drew his last breath, his eyes opened one last time. Almost, his sons agreed, as if in greeting.